Hi, boys and girls. Well, the cat is back in the bedroom eating cat treats with the door closed, and Buddy is outside. So hopefully, I can be less distracted today as I'm talking to you. It is Wednesday, April the 22nd, so I want to give a shout out to Kate and Tanner and to Sarah Zuniga. Love you both. Sarah, I was thinking about sometimes at recess you would laugh real loudly when Carly or one of the other girls would do something funny and it made me giggle. I do miss that. Caden, I miss you too. Okay, well, guys, I've seen on your iReady that a lot of you are really working. One of you had 2 hours when I checked yesterday. That was awesome. So keep up the good work there. Or if you're working in your workbook, do one lesson per day at least and be reading a lot. For the writing, I noticed that 6 of you have already finished your writing assignment. I'm mainly wanting you to think about someone you're not getting to spend time with right now because of the shelter in place that's going on and who you'd really love to spend time with. I forgot to mention to read aloud, or you can share on your paper. So if you've already submitted it to Mayan or sent me a picture of it, just tell your parent to send me a quick note on the Remind app that I can read it next Monday. Okay, we're about to read this chapter called Fresh Water to Drink. You can see Paul there digging the well. I want you to listen for these 5 things especially. Who helped Paul finish his well? What did Paul always do before he would go down into the well as it got deeper? What would have happened to Mr. Scott if Paul hadn't rescued him? Why was it important to put a candle down first before going down into the well? And this one you're going to have to infer. After the well was finished, a cover was put over it, and I want you to say why it would be important to put a cover over the well. There could be several reasons, so just name one. Okay, here we go. Fresh water to drink. Paul had made the bedstead. He had smoothed the oak slabs till there was not a splinter on them. Then he pegged them firmly together. 4 slabs made a box to hold the straw tick. Across the bottom of it, Paul stretched a rope, zigzagged from side to side, and pulled tight. One end of the bedstead Paul pegged solidly to the wall in a corner of the house. Only one corner of the bed was not against a wall. At this corner, Paul set up a tall slab. He pegged it to the bedstead. As high up as he could reach, he pegged 2 strips of oak to the walls and to the tall slab. Then he climbed up on them and pegged the top of the tall slab solidly to a rafter. And on the strips of oak he laid a shelf above the bed. "There you are, Caroline," he said. "I can't wait to see it made up," said Ma. "Help me bring in the straw tick." She had filled the straw tick that morning. There was no straw on the high prairie, so she had filled it with dry, clean, dead grass. It was hot from the sunshine, and it had a grassy, sweet smell. Pa helped her bring it into the house and lay it on the bedstead. She tucked the sheets in and spread her prettiest patchwork quilt over them. At the head of the bed, she set up the goose feather pillows and spread the pillow shams against them. On each white pillow sham, 2 little birds were outlined with red thread. Then Pa and Ma and Laura and Mary stood and looked at the bed. It was a very nice bed. The zigzag rope was softer than the floor to sleep on. The straw tick was plump with the sweet-smelling grass. The quilt lay smooth, and the pretty pillow sham stood up crisply. The shelf was a good place to store things. The whole house had quite an air with such a bed in it. That night when Ma went to bed, she settled into the crackling straw tick and said to Pa, "I declare I'm so comfortable it's almost sinful." Mary and Laura still slept on the floor, but Pa would make a little bed for them as soon as he could. He had made the big bed, and he had made a stout cupboard and padlocked it, so the Indians could not take all the cornmeal if they came again. Now he had only to dig a well, and then he would make that trip to town. He must dig the well first so that Ma could have water while he was gone. Next morning he marked a large circle in the grass near the corner of the house. With his spade he cut the sod inside the circle and lifted it up in large pieces. Then he began to shovel out the earth, digging himself deeper and deeper down. Mary and Laura must not go near the well while Pa was digging. Even when they couldn't see his head anymore, shovelfuls of earth kept flying up. At last the spade flew up and fell in the grass. Then Pa jumped. His hands caught hold of the sod, then one elbow gripped it, and then the other elbow, and with a heave, Pa came rolling out. "I can't throw the dirt out from any deeper," he said. He had to have help now, so he took his gun and rode away on Patty. When he came back, he brought a plump rabbit, and he had traded work with Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott would help him dig this well, and then he would help dig Mr. Scott's well. Ma and Laura and Mary had not seen Mr. and Mrs. Scott. Their house was hidden somewhere in a little valley on the prairie. Laura had seen the smoke rising up from it, and that was all. At sunup next morning, Mr. Scott came. He was short and stout. His hair was bleached by the sun, and his skin was bright red and scaly. He did not tan, he peeled. "It's this blasted sun and wind," he said. "Beg your pardon, ma'am, but it's enough to make a saint use strong language. I might as well be a snake the way I keep shedding my skin in this country." Laura liked him. Every morning, as soon as the dishes were washed and the beds made, she ran out to watch Mr. Scott and Pa working at the well. The sunshine was blistering, even the winds were hot, and the prairie grasses were turning yellow. Mary preferred to stay in the house and sew on her patchwork quilt, but Laura liked the fierce light and the sun and the wind, and she couldn't stay away from the well. But she was not allowed to go near its edge. Pa and Mr. Scott had made a stout windlass. I'll show you a picture in a moment. It stood over the well, and 2 buckets hung from it on the ends of a rope. When the windlass was turned, 1 bucket went down into the well, and the other bucket came up. In the morning, Mr. Scott slid down the rope and dug. He filled the buckets with earth almost as fast as Pa could haul them up and empty them. After dinner, which was lunch for them, Pa slid down the rope into the well, and Mr. Scott hauled up the buckets. Every morning before Pa would let Mr. Scott go down the rope, he set a candle in a bucket and lighted it and lowered it to the bottom. Once Laura peeped over the edge, and she saw the candle brightly burning far down in the dark hole in the ground. Then Pa would say, "Seems to be all right," and he would pull up the bucket and blow out the candle. And here is a picture of the windlass. And there's Mr. Scott looking on. You can see the candle inside the bucket, and Laura is also looking. "That's all foolishness, Ingalls," Mr. Scott said. "The well was all right yesterday." "You can't ever tell," Pa replied. "Better be safe than sorry." That's one thing Pa would say a lot. Laura did not know what danger Pa was looking for by that candlelight. She did not ask because Pa and Mr. Scott were busy. She meant to ask later, but she forgot. One morning, Mr. Scott came while Pa was eating breakfast. They heard him shout, "Hi, Ingalls, it's sunup, let's go." Pa drank his coffee and went out. The windlass began to creak, and Pa began to whistle. Laura and Mary were washing the dishes, and Ma was making the big bed when Pa's whistling stopped. They heard him say, "Scott!" He shouted, "Scott! Scott!" Then he called, "Caroline, come quick!" Ma ran out of the house. Laura ran after her. "Scott's fainted or something down there," Pa said. "I've got to go down after him." "Did you send down the candle?" Ma asked. "No, I thought he had. I asked him if it was all right, and he said it was." Pa cut the empty bucket off the rope and tied the rope firmly to the windlass. "Charles, you can't. You mustn't," Ma said. "Caroline, I've got to." "You can't. Oh, Charles, no." "I'll make it all right. I won't breathe till I get out. We can't let him die down there." Ma said fiercely, "Laura, keep back." So Laura kept back. She stood against the house and shivered. "No, no, Charles, I can't let you," Ma said. "Get on Patty and go for help." "There isn't time." "Charles, if I can't pull you up, if you keel over down there and I can't pull you up." "Caroline, I've got to go," Pa said. He swung into the well. His head slid out of sight down the rope. Ma crouched and shaded her eyes, staring down into the well. All over the prairie, meadowlarks were rising, singing, flying straight up into the sky. The wind was blowing warmer, but Laura was cold. Suddenly Ma jumped up and seized the handle of the windlass. She tugged at it with all her might. The rope strained and the windlass creaked. Laura thought that Pa had keeled over down in the dark bottom of the well, and Ma couldn't pull him up, but the windlass turned a little and then a little more. Pa's hand came up, holding to the rope. His other hand reached above it and took hold of the rope. Then Pa's head came up. His arm held onto the windlass. Then somehow he got to the ground and sat there. The windlass whirled around and there was a thud deep down in the well. Pa struggled to get up and Ma said, "Sit still, Charles. Laura, get some water, quick." Laura ran. She came hurrying back, lugging the pail of water. Pa and Ma were both turning the windlass. The rope slowly wound itself up, and the bucket came up out of the well, and tied to the bucket and the rope was Mr. Scott. His arms and his legs and his head hung and wobbled. His mouth was partly open and his eyes half shut. Pa tugged him onto the grass. Pa rolled him over and he flopped where he was rolled. Pa felt his wrist and listened at his chest, and then Pa lay down beside him. "He's breathing," Pa said. "He'll be all right in the air. I'm all right, Caroline. I'm plumb tuckered out is all." And here is a picture of them rescuing Mr. Scott. "Well," Ma scolded, "I should think you would be. Of all the senseless performances, my goodness gracious, scaring a body to death, all for the want of a little reasonable care. My goodness, She covered her face with her apron and burst out crying. That was a terrible day. "I don't want a well," Ma sobbed. "It isn't worth it. I won't have you running such risks." Mr. Scott had breathed a kind of gas that stays deep in the ground. It stays at the bottom of wells because it is heavier than the air. It cannot be seen or smelled, but no one can breathe it very long and live. Pa had gone down into that gas to tie Mr. Scott to the rope so that he could be pulled up out of the gas. When Mr. Scott was able, he went home. Before he went, he said to Pa, "You were right about that candle business, Ingalls. I thought it was all foolishness, and I would not bother with it, but I found out my mistake." "Well," said Pa, "where a light can't live, I know I can't, and I like to be safe when I can be, but all's well that ends well." Pa rested a while. He had breathed a little of the gas, and he felt like resting. But that afternoon he raveled a thread from a tow sack, and he took a little powder from his powder horn. He tied the powder in a piece of cloth with one end of the tow string in the powder. "Come along, Laura," he said, "and I'll show you something." They went to the well. Pa lighted the end of the string and waited till the spark was crawling quickly along it. Then he dropped the little bundle into the well. In a minute they heard a muffled bang, and a puff of smoke came out of the well. "That will bring the gas," Pa said. When the smoke was all gone, he let Laura light the candle and stand beside him while he let it down. All the way down in the dark hole, the little candle kept on burning like a star. So next day, Paul and Mr. Scott went on digging the well, but they always sent the candle down every morning. There began to be a little water in the well, but it was not enough. The buckets came up full of mud, and Paul and Mr. Scott worked every day in deeper mud. In the mornings, when the candle went down, it lighted oozing wet walls, and candlelight sparkled in rings over the water when the bucket struck bottom. Paul stood knee-deep in water and bailed out bucketfuls before he could begin digging in the mud. One day when he was digging, a loud shout came echoing up. Ma ran out of the house and Laura ran to the well. "Pull, Scott, pull!" Paul yelled. A swishing, gurgling sound echoed down there. Mr. Scott turned the windlass as fast as he could, and Paul came up climbing hand over hand up the rope. "I'm blamed if that's not quicksand," Paul gasped as he stepped onto the ground, muddy and dripping. I was pushing down hard on the spade when all of a sudden it went down the whole length of the handle, and water came pouring up all around me. "A good 6 feet of this rope's wet," Mr. Scott said, winding it up. The bucket was full of water. "You showed sense in getting out of that hand over hand, Ingalls. That water came up faster than I could pull you out." Then Mr. Scott slapped his thigh and shouted, "I'm blasted if you didn't bring up the spade." Sure enough, Paul had saved the spade. In a little while the well was almost full of water. A circle of blue sky lay not far down in the ground, and when Laura looked at it, a little girl's head looked up at her. When she waved her hand on the water surface, a hand waved too. The water was clear and cold and good. Laura thought she had never tasted anything so good as those long, cold drinks of water. Paul hauled no more stale, warm water from the creek. He built a solid platform over the well and a heavy cover for the hole that let the water bucket through. Laura must never touch that cover, but whenever she or Mary was thirsty, Ma lifted the cover and drew a dripping bucket of cold, fresh water from that well. And there you see, Ma has lifted the cover, or Paul lifted it for her, and she's getting good, cool, fresh water out. That makes me thirsty. Okay, listen for the questions now. Like yesterday, I'll give you about 5 seconds, so if you're not quite ready, just pause it and then you can turn it back on. Number 1, who helped Paul finish his well? The answer is Mr. Scott. Number 2, what did Paul always do before going down into the well? He put a candle in the bucket and lowered the candle down. Number 3, what would have happened to Mr. Scott if Paul hadn't rescued him? The book says the gas could kill someone, so it's pretty certain that he would have died. Number 4, why was it important to put a candle down first? What were they checking for? Okay, the book, of course, there's some gas down there that can kill someone, and the book describes it this way. Mr. Scott had breathed a kind of gas that stays deep in the ground. It stays at the bottom of wells because it is heavier than the air. It cannot be seen or smelled, but no one can breathe it very long and live. Okay, and then, let's see. The last one is, we saw the picture of the cover over the well, and I want you, it doesn't really tell us why there's a cover, but there could be several reasons why, so name at least one. Okay, here are some possible answers. The first reason is if the girls were playing and running around, or if someone was just walking by, especially at dark time, and they didn't know there was a well there and it wasn't covered, they could fall in and possibly drown. Another reason is it would keep things out, like the water would stay cleaner with a cover on from things dropping into the water. So those are several reasons that it could be. Boys and girls, one thing I did today was I made some cornbread because in the chapter on the Indians in the house and other chapters it kept mentioning cornbread, and I finally just had to have some. But that does go along with the lesson in iReady and in the workbook this week about a technical text. So ask your one of your parents if you could make some cornbread. They probably have a recipe. If not, you could Google it, or I don't even mind sending you the recipe I used. I'm using my mother's recipe. The only thing is, in her recipe, she would add 1/4 of a cup of sugar, and I didn't add that, but you could if you like sweet cornbread. Have a great day, guys.